track today is going to be from Dr. Bill Rouse. He's from Georgetown University. If you've been following us for the last 2 days, you may have seen him once or twice before. He is the Senior Fellow in the Office of Georgetown Senior Vice President for Research at the McCourt School of Public Policy, and he is also a researcher, educator, author, and entrepreneur. And today he's going to be talking to us about policy innovations to enhance the STEM talent pipeline. Over to you, Bill.
So this is an interesting project. It's about 6 months old. The team is from Stevens, Purdue, University of Massachusetts, and Georgetown. And so we have quite a diverse set of people. It includes people who are system engineers, but it also includes people like John Lombardi, who's a historian, and other people who are former state education officials. So we have a very diverse team, and it's been a very exciting project. The question is how to enhance the flow of STEM talent throughout the United States. And that's what this presentation is going to present, what we've found so far in our first 6 months. Next slide, please. So we're going to start off with what are the questions that our research sponsor posed, and then what's the pipeline of whereby students actually end up as STEM employees, either in the government or in the private sector. We'll talk a bit about an economic model we've developed to evaluate retention investments. And we'll talk about the issue of how do we get K through 12 and community colleges and employers to work together so that the pipeline goes from students to college to employment. Next slide, please. So these are the questions that were posed by our sponsor, Research and Engineering within OSD. How do we increase the percentage of students graduating K through 12 that are STEM ready? What interventions are available? What will it take to attract more STEM ready US students to STEM programs? What will it take to get institutes to offer STEM related programs that attract more students? To what extent are answers to these questions related to content, cost, and convenience? How sensitive and pragmatic are students' decisions? To what extent are institutions' strategies mainly focused on leveraging sunk costs and keeping the operating system working? What policies and incentives can close the gap? What attributes are most important? And what factors tend to influence decisions to change employment? So it's very broad questions. So our first task in the next slide was to start to look at, okay, what is this pipeline? Okay, and we're going to see it starts off in elementary school, and we're going to have a few things from the literature and talk about what policies might impact this, and then we'll get much more specific. So next slide. Okay, here's the STEM pipeline from students in K through 12 school graduating. You see there's a probability that they're STEM ready. There's a probability they pick STEM. There's a probability they graduate from STEM, and one minus that probability they don't graduate from STEM. From graduation, they go on to graduate school or to employment, both STEM or non-STEM. Same way with non-STEM graduates. So it's a fairly interesting and extended pipeline. And there's more to it. The next slide. This is how we get to students getting out of K through 12. So we start off with the K through 4 population, and we look at whether they have STEM interests. STEM experiences play a very important role in people being interested in STEM. STEM experiences can be from family members or work opportunities or a variety of things. And we try to get to the 9 through 12 population and get them taking the STEM courses they need to be STEM ready. And a significant portion of students are not STEM ready. I'll give you some statistics on that in a few minutes. But one of the problems is that a lot of high schools don't offer the courses that you need to be STEM ready. That includes Algebra 1, Algebra 2, geometry, trigonometry, pre-calculus, physics, chemistry, biology, etc. There's a significant portion of the schools in the United States that only offer Algebra 1. That's the highest level STEM course in the school. So the whole population of those schools can never become STEM ready. And that's a very significant problem. And we're not going to address that so much today, but it is a significant problem that needs attention over time. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so we take our pipeline model and we get all these probabilities. What we got, I think 17 probabilities. Now, some of these are very much available from the literature and databases that we have access to. We fortunately have access to quite an extent of data sets. And some of these can be estimated, and some of these have to be studied via sensitivity analysis. If we go to the next slide. So what percentage of high school students are STEM ready? It's 16%. That's really amazing, okay, to see that low percentage are STEM ready. But there's some other interesting statistics, which I don't have on the slides here, but I'll mention. What percentage of people in the United States can do arithmetic, like addition and subtraction? It's 60-some percent. In other words, almost 40% of the population of the US can't do addition and subtraction. So we have some really significant challenges. 20% of high school graduates choose STEM majors, so it's even more than those who are STEM ready. 50% of STEM graduates graduate non-STEM. 60% of STEM grads take non-STEM jobs. Interestingly, 90% of STEM grads report that they still use their STEM skills, even though their job is not considered a STEM job, which is very interesting. And it seems to me there's a lot of advantage of having STEM background, being in other areas of the economy that isn't necessarily considered STEM. We need better estimates of these probabilities in general. These are rough estimates, and there's often disparate sources for them. The 16% of high school graduates, though, seems pretty steady when all the literature we've looked at. Next slide. So if we look at our probabilities and we look at our incentives, we know what we could do to increase these probabilities. Incentives to provide offerings that increase students' interest, okay, would affect those. Provide STEM experiences to increase interest and competencies. Provide incentives for industry to pay paid internships. Information that enhances students' abilities to make well-informed decisions. And I won't go through the whole list, but let's reflect a little bit on the students' situation. Basically, what we found from the different research we've looked at and the data sets we've looked at is that students need some role model to potentially engage in STEM. It could be a parent, it could be a neighbor, it could be someone they happen to meet through school. Okay, they need STEM experiences. They need a chance to engage in a bit of science, to use some applied math. They need a variety of things to motivate them to go in the STEM path. And those are very important besides the courses. And the role models are very important. If you don't know anyone who's been an engineer or a scientist or a STEM person, very unlikely you're going to pick to go in a STEM direction. The other interesting thing we found, and this is really kind of an amazing statistic, if you finish third grade, this is in grade school, if you finish third grade and you were not up to a third grade reading level, chances are you'll never go to college. In other words, the mold is set for a 9-year-old. Okay, this is just astounding. We need to focus on those problems, although that's not the problems we chose to focus on first. We've identified those problems, but we haven't decided to focus on those at the start. Next slide. So we did develop an economic model of retention investments. You look at your number of students at risk, the number of students that are high, moderate, and low risk. You look at the tuition you have to work with beyond the cost of instruction. You come up with your estimates of your support costs and your process costs, and these are all in separate spreadsheets. You look at the bonus for risk reduction, look at the success rate of translating students from one risk category to another, and a discount rate for the future calculation. So in this particular version, this is actually 7 linked Excel models. So it's much more complicated than this dashboard. But in this case, the expected return is $27 million, and 91% of the students are retained. Okay. And the bonuses paid are $681,000 for retention. Okay. The 95% confidence model, don't forget, an expected value means 50% chance the number is higher and 50% chance the number is lower. a lot of decision makers are risk averse, and they want to know what's the number that I can be 95% sure it'll be at least that. And so our model calculates that 95% confidence level. And you can see here the NPV is a little bit lower. The number of students retained is significantly lower, and consequently the bonuses are lower. Now you might say, why isn't the NPV much lower? And the reason is simply because you're making the investments, but you're not getting the return. So most of the NPV here is tied up in all the money the institutions have to spend. So the next slide shows a typical example of the students that are high risk. You can see the blue and how they transition down to become low risk over time. And you can see, plus the cost of student support, initially, even though only 20% of the students are high risk, they're consuming almost all the resources because they need so much remedial work and tutoring and advising. And then over time, as they transition, because of the student support services and because of the process improvements, you can see most of the costs by the time we get out to the 10th year is going to the low students. But now we're supporting, instead of supporting 20 students with $4 million, we're 200 students with $4 million. We're supporting 1,000 students with $2 million. So the cost per student has gone down dramatically. And this model allows people to play with their potential investments, and we can tailor to each individual university what their costs are and what the risks are of their students. Next slide. Okay, so one of our major thrusts that is led by Mike Gargano and John Lombardi at UMass is to look at what if we integrated K through 12 with community colleges and employers. And particularly, we're looking at defense companies in Connecticut, which there are quite a few. The idea is that the student in K through 12, usually typically in high school, is interested in a particular kind of employment with Pratt & Whitney or Sikorsky or whatever defense company. And the community college devises a program to help these students gain the skills in high school and community college to be able to go directly into employment and the jobs. Okay, so the interesting thing about this one is in some of the instances, some of the versions of the model, the students who graduate from high school get a community college associate degree at the same time because the high school and the community college will work so closely together. And the employers are just waiting for these people because they've actually said in advance that's who they need. So these are some of the topics I'm going to go over. This is a very exciting possibility. We had a recent meeting with the president of the Chamber of Commerce of South Carolina about implementing this model in South Carolina. And they were very interested, but that's just, of course, early in the discussion. Let's go to the next slide. So the state of Connecticut has 4 comprehensive universities, 12 community colleges, and 1 charter college. It includes quite a bit of programmatic material for engineering and technology disciplines. And there's also a regional center for next generation manufacturing, and is designed as a primary facilitator and education provider for advanced manufacturing. In other words, the state of Connecticut has focused on the employers of STEM technical workforce. Now, this is a skilled technical workforce that needs education and training, but they don't need a bachelor's degree, at least not at first. And so the question is, how do we pipeline these people right into well-paying employment? Next slide, please. These are just examples of what people are trained in, what employers are asking for. And you can see there's ranging from electromechanic maintenance to computer software, to water management, to web designer. These are skilled jobs. These are not something someone right out of K through 12 can usually qualify for. Next slide. And some of the advanced manufacturing facts. The 12 community colleges, they enroll around 3,000 students in advanced manufacturing programs. They annually graduate about 630. The 3-year graduation average has steadily improved, not because people are it wasn't because they were failing, it was failing to get them enrolled is why the numbers were lower at first. Pandemic has had an impact. Basically, they're generating graduates that are immediately going into high-paying, skilled technical jobs. Next slide. And some of the community college certificates they're getting. A certificate might be like 20 hours or something like it, 21 hours, not the 120 it takes to graduate, but people are getting certificates. And the interesting thing is the certificates are stackable. So if you got three or four certificates, or maybe 5, you actually get an associate degree. Okay, so now you have a real credential, and you're getting people in this STEM pipeline and getting them to be successful and moving into these jobs. Next slide, please. Next slide. Here we go. So here we have the program. Go back, please. Back one. Okay. Associate programs. These are the ones who are getting the 2-year college degrees. You can see the areas they're in, all very high tech areas. Next slide. And this is what's the ecosystem? There are 4,000 plus manufacturing companies in the state. There are 161,000 employees, about 10% of the state's workforce. About 20% of that workforce plan to retire in the next few years, and some people say it's even higher. So they're going to add 11,000 new jobs. Primary growth, fabricated metals, machine shops, aerospace products, transportation equipment. So and there's just a footnote here. There could be a little bit of double counting some of these numbers. When we talk to people in South Carolina, they're one of the largest automobile manufacturing states in the country, with BMW and Mercedes and Volvo. And they also have an immense defense industry that needs the same kind of jobs Connecticut needs. There are some really well-paying jobs available if we can actually educate the people and train them to be able to take these jobs. And employers are very enthusiastic about this. Next slide, please. And this is another focus on defense contracts and what do they need. Electric Boat is is planning to go, and they're in the submarine business, going from 14,000 to 18,000 employees. United Technologies, Pratt and Whitney. So you can see there's a need, there's a demand, and the need that the DoD sensed in putting this contract in place is very clear that they're right. There is a need, and it's not just that we need bachelor's, master's, and PhDs in science and engineering. We need people in this skilled technical workforce. Otherwise, we may be able to dream up wonderful ideas, but we won't be able to manufacture them, and that's going to be a problem. So, next slide, please. And we looked at advanced components manufacturing. Okay, building the pieces of the puzzle. And the next couple of slides show some of the numbers. Next slide. Go back one. Okay, this is the hiring. You can see they hired about 400 in 2018 in jobs that I think we would all agree are STEM jobs. Next slide. The 2019, the number gets a bit bigger. And then I think next slide is 2021, 2020 needs. So you can see there's just a steady need of skilled technical workforce. Next slide. And projection, okay, for 2021. It's a little lower at this point. This data may be from earlier in the year. So next slide. No, back one. No, ahead one. There, okay. The other thing we've been looking at is there are four-year universities where a lot of students drop out. And the 50% dropout in STEM is mostly not at the top tier universities. They have retention rates like of 98%, 95%. and students drop out. And so the question is, can we come up with a program that allows people to drop out, say, after 2 years and get an associate's degree, and then re-enter the system later on, maybe after they've saved some more money or the family needs they had to face were addressed. And so we're looking at how do we just redesign the FourYear Universities to incorporate students who are not really ready to do the 4 years. They're ready to make progress towards the 4 years. And that's another element of this solution. Now the next slide. Key takeaways. We want to go back to key takeaways. We want to meet the needs of the economy. And some of that need is for bachelor's, master's, PhD, but a huge need is for the skilled technical workforce. And how do we prepare them for the well-paying, technically oriented jobs that are there and are continue to be there, especially as our systems get more and more complex? We need a way to actually dovetail K through 12, community college, and employment and employers. We don't want these to be separate silos. We want people to be communicating. We want to make sure that we're actually managing the pipeline so employment needs are met and students' needs are met who aspire to these jobs. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the last slide. We see we have a new poll up here. We've got to refine our understanding of the scalability of various policies, programs. There are numerous pilot studies and a huge literature of things that have been done with 100 students or whatever, and great results. But how do you scale that? We're going to transition from conceptual and Excel-based models to developing more interactive system dynamics models. So we're going to make our models a bit more formal. We're going to expand data analysis and synthesis to support the above two activities, guided by the excellent and continuous engagement we have with the sponsor. We meet with the sponsor every 2 weeks for intense discussions, and it's been very, very fruitful. We would not have made the progress we've made without that engagement of the sponsors. There is one caveat, though, we want to add. The data tends to be spotty and sometimes speculative. For example, it's just surveys. It's what people think. It's not any measurements of actual behaviors. So we're dealing with an issue of a lot of data, but not all of it is really good. And some of the different data sets are not comparable. But we'll get smarter at this as we work on this further. This is a very important problem. This is a very important problem just nationally of how do we prepare our young people to enter the workforce, wherever they choose to enter, with the right skills so they're ready to succeed. This is a very important problem, and we are really fortunate to be able to work on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Bill. I invite you, if you're willing, to turn your camera on, and we'll, while we're waiting for questions from the audience, I had a few questions, if you don't mind. So the first question I had is, I know that you also heard Ruth and Jeff's conversation and presentation. Of course, I made some connections and identified some synergies. Just, do you have any thoughts or reactions based on the combination of it?
Well, when we first started on this, we were mainly just focused on academia. First, just in higher education. We ended up having to trace back into K through 12 because it has such a huge constraint on what academia can do and the extent to which students are prepared. And then Mike Gargano, who was a higher education official in Connecticut, talked about this program that he led in development in Connecticut. And we said, wow, this is really amazing. Rather than thinking about having one study on industry and one study on academia, why don't we have some work going on that crosses those boundaries and makes them not boundaries? And so I do see more synergy between what Ruth and Jeff are doing and what we're doing than I did a few months ago. And then when I went to South Carolina and talked with the president of Chamber of Commerce about this problem in the skilled technical workforce, he said, every single state has this problem. He says, it's not just Connecticut or South Carolina, every state has this problem. And if you can come up with ways of improving the situation, that would be great. And then when I talked with our DoD sponsors, they said, well, first of all, why don't you try to learn what everybody else is doing? Not just assume that Connecticut has the answer, although they seem to have a really good answer. So we're coming up to now talk with South Carolina more. Well, what actually are you doing to address this problem? I'm not sure we have to talk to 50 states. Maybe we need to talk to 3 or 4, because we've happened onto a problem that is really, really fascinating and has enormous impact on the workforce and on, of course, people getting jobs as an electrician at Sikorsky get paid a lot more than if they served food at McDonald's, right? It's way into the middle class, which we need them to succeed at, and we need them to succeed because the workforce needs to be there. So I see many more connections. There is one piece that I find a little troubling, and that is the unevenness of the K through 12 system in the United States. It seems to me, as we've looked at more and more of what schools do, a lot of schools really are not stepping up to actually do the best job they can to educate students to become productive members of the workforce. Part of it is because of local control. You can have a school board where the whole board has no expertise whatsoever in education, but they think they do. Okay, and so that's a significant problem. And but nevertheless, I'm fascinated by all this, and I think it's an extremely important problem. And I think what Ruth and Jeff are doing, what we're doing, is very complementary.
Absolutely. And in public health, as you know as well, we have the same issue of not really a healthcare system, but a patchwork quilt of the federated 51 different systems and counties doing things differently, et cetera. So I think you're just highlighting some of the systemic issues nicely. I had a question about T-shaped skills, but it looks like Tom McDermott asked essentially the same question, so I'll read this out for you. Studies are emphasizing employability skills, which I would call lightweight STEM versus deep STEM. Are we appropriately focused on breadth of STEM skills in all students versus the number of STEM graduates? And he says employability, by employability, he means leadership, communication, problem solving, critical thinking, and the ability to use technology.
I agree. I mean, I think we need to broaden our view of it. So one of the interesting things when you look at, I did a whole side study on the behavioral economics of student choice. And what do we know about that? And there's quite a bit of literature on that. And as I mentioned briefly, and when I talked, is students who have no exposure to STEM, whatever, by relatives, parents, other things, they're very unlikely to pick STEM. It's just totally abstract. But okay, what do? Do you try to explain to them what science is? I don't think so. I think you give them experiences where they do science, maybe light science, rather than flying missile weapons or equipment to the moon. But they do light science, and they get that hands-on experience, and there's tremendous enthusiasm from students on this. And then they start to think, well, gee, can you actually do a job like this? And so I think if we could create that, and I was in a National Academy meeting earlier today, and we're focused on this problem of education and how do we create a series of workshops in the National Academy of Engineering. And one thing was really clear, and I've encountered this, but other people have too, is you can actually give a lot of engineering education in very early. And part of it is engineering experiences, where you get to experience what it's like to design something, or it's like to fabricate things. I mentioned in my earlier talk, at Georgetown, Dinesh and I have had several meetings on how do we create an engineering minor for liberal arts students. Now, why would we do that? Well, it's actually part of the makers movement. All across the US, a lot of universities are creating makers labs, and you can go in and build stuff and fabricate things, et cetera. And the desire to have an engineering minor comes from the students who are basically saying, well, if I'm going to build something, wouldn't it be nice if it worked? And so they're asking for the knowledge about design and maybe some techniques that will enable them to do that. I think the demand is actually there. Some of it's latent because people don't even know what we're talking about. But once you introduce them to it, I think we can get more people to want to pursue these kinds of jobs. I want to mention another thing. about the STEM workforce. I was fortunate to chair the School of Industrial and System Engineering at Georgia Tech and got to meet a lot of very successful alumni. I think, as I recall, the 40,000 alumni, 25% of them had job titles of president, CEO, or partner. I got to talk with them a lot. And I said, do you still think you're an engineer? And 100% of them said, of course, I use engineering every day. It's the way you think about things, the way you think about problems, the way you formulate problems. And so I think we need to have those problem formulation skills and analytical skills be pervasive across society, not just in STEM jobs. But, that's just my opinion.
It's an opinion that I share, and I know Tom McDermott shares as well. We are almost out of time, but I had one final question for you. Have you worked with NGOs or nonprofit organizations in this task? The one that came into my mind while you were presenting was MicroWorks. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's all about this idea that there are good, well-paying jobs that are going empty because we don't have the skilled workforce to do it. Some of those jobs are more STEM related than others, but it's particularly they give scholarships so people can go through the training for those types of jobs. And so I was just wondering if there were organizations like that you all are reaching out to.
We haven't been reaching them out to in this project. I've had quite a bit of experiences like that in developing countries where you're trying to train people to move into the technical workforce. Some of the lessons learned were really kind of amazing. For example, when you provide the training, you need to provide housing and food for the whole family. Because if that person's not at work, that family doesn't eat. And it makes sense after you learn it, but you just didn't expect it. And so I haven't done that within the West. But I think that the advocacy agencies, the advocacy groups, we've worked a lot with advocacy groups for disabled and older adults, and it's immense, the number of advocacy groups. The one difficulty I have is that each advocacy group seems to think that their issue is the only issue. And so it gets pretty complicated, but you got to do it.
Fair enough. Well, Bill, this was fascinating. I really enjoyed it. Best of luck. I hope your project goes well. Look forward to seeing more results next year.
Yep.
This wraps up the end of our human capital development track. So we'll have a short break and then we'll come back together for closing remarks. And again, Bill, thanks so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Take care.